Hey church, we have a lot of exciting things happening across the entire church next week, but for one campus in particular, it's extra special. And that's because next Sunday, September 10th, South Hills, Virginia is hosting their grand opening. Let's give God a huge round of applause for this moment. We are so excited for the campus pastor, Chris and Stephanie, and the rest of their team to celebrate this huge milestone. South Hills, Virginia, I know you guys have already walked through quite a few ups and downs together, but I also believe with all of my heart that God is just getting started. So here's what I want to ask for the rest of the church. First, that all of us would be praying for the grand opening next Sunday. Secondly, if you know anyone in the Yorktown, Virginia area, I'd love for you to reach out to them this week and invite them to the grand opening. So pull out your phones real quick because South Hills, Virginia is launching next Sunday, September 10th at 10 a.m. at Coventry Elementary School in Yorktown, Virginia. So as we prepare for this, let's all join together and pray for what God is going to do in South Hills, Virginia.
We are kicking off a brand new series today called Tiny Golden Statues. And you don't know how, that's not me. You don't know how awkward it was for me to put a trophy with a dollar sign right front and center. And people already think churches are weird, but that's one of the things we're going to talk about this month. So I didn't make the trophies. So just you got to bear with me. So in our family, we're actually not a big video game family. Nintendo came out with the Wii almost 20 years ago. And we bought a used one about 10 or 12 years ago, and it's still kind of the big thing around our house. And we like to kick it kind of like old school retro style in our family. So a few years ago, I have 4 kids. Many of you know Kai, he is 13. And probably about 5 or 6 years ago, we were just hanging out, and he was like, "Dad, Jesus is horrible at basketball." And I was like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, he's got no defense. He can't shoot the 3. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Jesus." And I was like, "I know you're talking about Jesus. What are you talking about Jesus in basketball for?" He's like, "He's horrible. Kaylee created Jesus on the Wii, and I was playing with him, and I was playing basketball, and he's terrible." And I was like, "It's probably the sandals. You can't play basketball in sandals." But our boys actually love creating like the characters and the avatars on Wii Sports, maybe almost as much as they love playing the games. I love to watch them play because they're so into it. We have an 8-year-old his name is Kelton, and it is a full body workout because he jumps and twists and he's trying to steer everybody, and his body it's like VR for him. He thinks he's controlling everything with the movement of his body. He's just so into it. But they end up playing a couple of the same games over and over and over again, partly because they're fun and they enjoy them. But I think the bigger part is because they're actually pretty good at them, which honestly is how we all are, right? Like we put most of our time and effort into things that we're good at. We tend to value the things that make us feel valuable. Because we all want to win, right? If we're just honest, of course, we'd want to win in general, in life, but especially at life, right? We want to win everything we get involved in, but when it comes to life, none of us wants to lose, right? We're all chasing trophies, and some of those trophies are real and tangible. Some of them are invisible and imagined. I think at some point, we all sort of wake up or come to the conclusion that life is short and it's really hard. And so we want to squeeze every ounce of enjoyment out of it that we can. And so you have my permission, have that extra cup of donut holes this morning. It's a holiday weekend. We're going to have extras. Take some home. But also, we all experience, like, when we get to the end, we want it for it to have mattered that we lived, right? That the story that we told with our lives, it wasn't just about following or indulging our cravings or our desires or our impulses, but that our life left a mark. We want to know that life didn't just happen to us, but we did our best to live the life that we wanted to actually live. We want to love and be loved. And maybe most of all, we want for there to be some meaning, some point to all of it. It turns out that deeper than our instinct to live is our longing to actually be alive, for our soul to be alive. And so we spend our days trying to win at the stuff that we think will bring us life. It's funny to me how some movie experiences get lodged in our brains. Sometimes it's the movie itself or a particular scene from a movie. Sometimes it's who we were with when we saw a specific movie. Sometimes it's just the way that the story made you feel. I'll never forget the first time that I saw the movie Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark when I was a kid. And the opening scene was just so intense, watching him make his way through the dark cave full of all the spider webs and booby traps, and he was so brave. And I was just a kid when that movie came out, a little kid. He was so brave, and yet he seemed kind of reckless. He was methodical, but also really resourceful, and he had that whip, which was amazing. And he finally makes it to the end of the cave, and the camera, as you see, the camera sort of pans around, and then you see it. You see that tiny golden statue. And then he goes up and he makes the trade-off and takes it, right? But he wasn't the only one that was in pursuit of that particular statue, that particular relic, right? There were other collectors and kind of some nefarious characters who were chasing it. The local tribes wanted it. He was double-crossed by his guide before it was all over with, right? Isn't it strange, though, that for all of our differences and diversity, that the human experience is almost universally it's the same, at least in the things that we spend our lives chasing after? And so that's really what this series is all about. Like, what are the trophies that you spend your time, your money, your effort, your life chasing? What are the things that you spend all of your effort pursuing? Now, maybe not surprisingly, God has a lot to say about the things that we're chasing and why we're chasing them, but maybe not for the reasons that you might expect. The conversation that God has with us over and over and over again in the scriptures is actually about life. In fact, Jesus, one of the most famous things he said in John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus said, I have come that they, meaning us, humanity, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Actually experience life the way that it was meant to be experienced. But it's not just the New Testament. It's not just a Jesus thing. This is the same conversation that God's been having with humanity from the beginning. If you go back over 1,000 years, go back in the Old Testament to the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 30. God is having a conversation with his people. In verse 19, God says this. He says, I've set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life. And he goes on, he says, love the Lord your God, listen to his voice and hold fast to him. Why? For the Lord is your life. See, the primary conversation that God is having with us throughout all of the scriptures is actually about life. It's about what it is and where to find it. Now, if that's the case, it would make sense that God would be really interested in our trophies, what we pursue. Because we spend our lives chasing those things that we think will actually bring us life. Now, God actually has a name in the scriptures for those kinds of trophies. He calls them idols. And I know if you're new to church, and well, even if you're not new to church, that language kind of makes us uncomfortable in a setting like this because it feels irrelevant. I mean, for some reason in our culture, we're fine with the word idol when it comes to entertainment or a TV show or a description of a celebrity, but we sort of roll our eyes and kind of check out when it comes up in a church or a faith setting. The problem is, right? The problem is when you read the scriptures, you can't escape the conversation that involve the idea of idols. It's everywhere. So it's probably worth our time to sort of step back and have the conversations together because that's really what we're talking about in this series. So what actually are we talking about? Because most of the ideas and the images that come to our mind are usually from movies and stories, and those really aren't that helpful. And so the simple definition of an idol is this: anything or anyone that we look to for the things that only God can give us. An idol is anything or anybody that we look to for the things that only God can give us, which means almost anything can be an idol, right? And maybe if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a church person, it's easy to think, yeah, well, this doesn't really apply to me because I believe in Jesus. But I think it actually applies to us maybe more so than those that don't. Look at this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning with verse 13, it says this: no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. So the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote this, he wrote this letter to a church, to a group of Christians. And he's going, look, you shouldn't be like so arrogant. You're going to have the same temptations and the same struggles that everybody else does. You're going to be tempted to fill your life with trophies, thinking that they can fulfill you and bring you hope and peace and meaning. You're going to have to intentionally fight against and run away from that tendency to do that. There's another place in 1 John chapter 5, verse 21. John, who was one of Jesus's part of his inner circle, one of the disciples, John wrote these words. He said, "Dear children, keep yourselves from idols." Now, the funny thing about this verse is it's the very last sentence in the book of 1 John. There's nothing else is said beyond that, which is a really odd way to end a book, right? And if that's not awkward enough, like this didn't start out as a book. Before it was a book in the Bible, it was just a letter written from John to a group of people, which is even a weirder way to end a letter, right? Can you imagine when the letter arrived? It arrives on parchment. These people are waiting. They haven't heard from John in a long time. They've heard rumors of who he is. The parchment arrives. Hey, God, we got a letter from John. They start reading that, read it all the way through to the end. There's one guy reading it to everybody. Everybody's gathered around. They're trying to hear. And you get to the end, and that's the ending. There's nothing else. He didn't say anything else. How awkward would that be? Like no, grace and peace be with you all. No, like, may the force be with you. No, like, stay classy, San Diego. Nothing came after. Flee from idols. I used to, there was a guy I used to work with, and he never, ever, ever said goodbye when you were on the phone with him. You would just, like, in the middle of talking, if he was done, he'd just go, okay, and then hang up. Like, is that good? Hello? Is that okay? Have you ever met somebody that they just kind of end the conversation? So I don't know why John ended the letter this way, but I can imagine that he's writing and he's like, look, this is so important. I want it to be the last thing they hear whenever this letter is read in the church. Keep yourselves from idols. I like the way one translation puts it. It reads this way: dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts. Why? Because God will be angry and punish you? Nope. Because like he said all the way back in Deuteronomy, because the Lord is your life. Maybe you have been a long-time Christian. Maybe you're somebody that's, you're a follower of Jesus. And you're like, nothing could take God's place in my heart. To which I think John would say, if you think that, you're exactly the kind of person that this is for. See, these trophies, this idea of idols, it's the stuff that we look at in our lives and we go, if I could just accomplish this, if I could just reach and attain that, if I could just get with them, if we lived over there and we drove that, then it would feel like we arrived. Then it would feel like we made it. Then it would feel like I have some value. Then it would feel like my life matters. Then it would feel like I'm complete. If I became the executive VP, or if I built my business to this level, then I would feel like I'm significant. Then I would feel like I'm secure. If we could just retire at 50 and travel full time and sit on the beach somewhere every day, then it would feel like we're really living. And that's part of the challenge with this conversation, right? Because we don't really think a lot of those things consciously, or at least say them out loud. Some of them we do, maybe a few of them. But most of those things that I just described, they're just feelings, impulses that are just sort of subconsciously driving us along in our life to pursue a kind of life that we think will bring us life. Now, honestly, there's all kinds of things that we could talk about this month, lesser trophies that we sort of pursue in individual ways. But this conversation is really about tackling 4 of the big ones that I think we all get drawn into chasing: power, approval, comfort, and control. I like the guy flexing. That's the guy for power. He kind of looks like me. Ripped with a 6-pack. The interesting thing with these trophies is that just like with anything else, just like with any trophy that you win, right? The goal isn't necessarily the trophy. It's what it represents, right? It's what it comes with once you have it. For example, we're not always aware of what's driving us, but we often pursue power and influence because when we have power and influence, the more power and influence we have, the more purposeful our life feels. Right? We often pursue approval and acceptance because those things give our life meaning. When we have healthy relationships, when we actually get applause from other people. We pursue comfort and pleasure to give us that sense of satisfaction and enjoyment in our life. We pursue control to give us safety and security. You might not think about it much, but those 4 things, purpose, meaning, satisfaction, security, they're fundamental to all of our lives and our experiences. We want them. We need them. Our lives aren't fulfilled without them. And so we work for them. We sacrifice for them. We aim our lives at them. We spend our time and money and energy trying to win all the things that we believe will give us more of those things. And that is where things start to go wrong. Now, of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with trophies. But we've all known people, we've all heard stories of people who wrecked their lives and their relationships. And it's almost always in pursuit of a trophy that they thought would do the opposite of wreck their life. They thought it would bring them life. They thought it would give them purpose. They thought it would make their life more meaningful or enjoyable or secure. See, that story isn't new. It's as old as humanity. And so we're going to take one of these trophies each week this month, and we're going to talk about why we fall for it and what we do about it. And today we're going to start with the idea of power. So one of my favorite books in the Bible is called Ecclesiastes. And part of the reason why I like it is in some ways it feels like it doesn't really fit in the Bible because it's got way more problems and way more questions than it does solutions or answers. I mean, it's full of the kind of complaints that we would make about God and life, which is one of the amazing things about God. See, if you're new to all this, the reality is God loves you so much, he not only gives you the freedom to reject him, but he includes some of the arguments that you can use against him in the Bible. Why? Well, because he's not trying to coerce or deceive or manipulate you, because he loves you and he wants to invite you into a relationship with him. And so he's not trying to hide all the messy parts of life and of faith. And so Ecclesiastes was written by a guy named Solomon, and Solomon wasn't just any guy. He was the king of Israel. His daddy was King David. King David was one of the most important and iconic figures in all of the scriptures. David is the only guy in the Bible who's described as a man after God's heart, which is an incredible thing. But purely from a human perspective, his son Solomon was far more successful than he was. David spent most of his life fighting wars. Solomon's reign was full of stability and peace. It was under Solomon's rule that Israel grew stronger and wealthier. He was the one who built the temple in Israel. His reputation and his renown stretched around the world. He's still regarded as the richest and wisest man who ever lived. But toward the end of his life, he was reflecting back over his life, and that's when he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. So I want to read you a little bit of some of his thoughts. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 3, he says this. He says, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. So this is kind of the theme of his book. He's going, look, I know I've got options that most people don't have. I'm a king, I'm powerful, I can do whatever I want, I'm rich beyond imagination. So I'm gonna use my life as an experiment to see if I can do it all and have it all. And so he chases hard after the trophies that we chase after. Look at what he says, the very next verse in Ecclesiastes 2:4. He says, so I undertook great projects. And from verse 4 all the way through verse 8, you can go read it, but he describes all the things that he did. It's incredible. The stuff that he built, the lands that he purchased, the wives that he had, all the relationships that he had, all the stuff that he built at his life. It was the pinnacle. And then in verse 9, he sort of sums it all up this way. He says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. He's going, look, I did it. I won not just a big trophy. I won the biggest trophy. I won all the trophies. I reached the pinnacle of success and power and accomplishment and achievement and greatness. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And honestly, given who his dad was, I don't know, he did a little something like fought a giant with a slingshot. Given who David was, like saying he became greater by far, he wasn't just like a little bit. I became greater by far than anyone else before me. I mean, that's quite a statement. Now, looking back, there's no way he could have known, but he definitely was greater than anyone who came after him. I mean, historically, Israel peaked as a kingdom when he was a king. Now, the interesting thing about Solomon's experience is that, as we're going to see here in a second, and he spends most of Ecclesiastes talking about, he ended up just kind of lost and cynical. He ended up wondering what the point and the purpose of life, of his life, was. For all the power that he had accumulated, for all the greatness that he had achieved, it didn't really amount to much for him. And that's the thing about idols. That's the thing about these trophies, is they not only can they not deliver on what they promise, they leave us empty and wanting more, which is exactly what happened to Solomon. This is what he says in verse 11 of chapter 2. He says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. It was a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. I mean, that is quite an admission. It was all meaningless. In fact, if you open up this book, if you open up Ecclesiastes and you begin to read the book of Ecclesiastes, that's how he opens the book. Those are the very first words he writes. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. It's also how he ends the book, that it's all empty and meaningless, that in the end, the trophies didn't matter. Here's the thing that's weird though. Before he even says that, you kind of already knew where it would lead, right? You don't need an ancient text or an ancient king to tell you that. Like, have you ever got your hands on some invisible trophy that you were chasing, that you thought that it would just be amazing, and you got your hands on it and it didn't feel anything like what you thought? It just sort of felt like, all right, it's just, okay, whatever. I mean, that's happened to me. But here's what's crazy when that happens. We're tempted to double down. Right? We're tempted to think that the problem isn't that we chase the wrong thing. The problem is that we need to go bigger. We need to go for the bigger prize. We need to go for the bigger trophy. See, you've known rich people who lived for money, and the cruel irony for them is despite their riches, they never had enough. They could never get enough. You've been around people who were obsessed with beauty and with their bodies, but they always felt ugly and less than. And as they started to get older and time and age started showing, they died 1 million deaths. Power's the same way. The more power we accumulate, the more we chase it, the bigger we make ourselves, the more vulnerable we feel. Honestly, for me, I never really thought this particular issue, this particular trophy was really an issue for me until just a few years ago. In the tail end of 2017 and into 2018, I didn't realize it, but until it all came to a head, but I was extremely angry. I had been through a lot of traumatic stuff in 2014, 15, and 16, the previous couple of years, stuff that I was completely powerless to do anything about. And so I didn't realize it, but in response to some of that stuff, I began sort of subconsciously, unconsciously pursuing power. trying to make sense of the things that had happened, trying to make myself and my life big enough where it couldn't happen again. See, the people who are preoccupied with power, they often look on the outside, they look confident, they look like they project that powerful, got it all together, my life has power and purpose and meaning, but inside they feel weak and afraid and vulnerable. They project the power, but they're always trying to make themselves look bigger. For me, I was tired. I was terrified that my life and all the stuff that I had gone through, that it was just pointless. And so it wasn't a conscious decision. I don't remember waking up going, I think I'm going to pursue power. I wasn't trying to take over the world. I was just trying to protect myself. One of the things I said all the time back then was that I'm tired of losing. I'm tired of losing. I'm tired of losing. I want to win. See, we often think of people who pursue power that they're just all about winning. Oftentimes, it's actually more about not losing than it is winning. And so I began living and leading like for me to be who I wanted to be, for me to really make the purpose of my life and my work, for me to make all of that happen, which is being a pastor, that I needed to be a little bit more powerful so that I could just go make it happen. Oh, the irony of that. And so there was this constant boiling anger always right beneath the surface for me. And it all came to a head on Christmas Eve in 2017. We had launched a church in Riverside, a campus for South Hills. And when it came to that Christmas Eve service, we were having all kinds of problems. We couldn't make it work. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. Stuff that was completely out of my control. People not showing up, doing what they said they were going to do. And it was all falling apart. And we were about an hour before the service was supposed to start. And I literally like thought I was going to have a heart attack. I was so beside myself. I ended up leaving. I went across into this other part of the building where nobody was, and I locked myself in this closet, and I just screamed and sobbed and just was unconsolable. I spent the rest of the day and the night, my my two older kids, they've always been a part of our church, and they've always served and helped, and it's just what we do as a family. They were there serving, and they were the only ones around. So they bore the brunt of all of that anger and all of my power and all of my, it was, I remember when it was all over and we went home that night, we sat together, and I was apologizing to everybody. See, nobody wants to feel like they're at the mercy of their anger. Nobody wants to feel like they're the ones that use people. The problem is that the power game makes it inevitable because you want to get to where you want to get to. You want to achieve what you want to achieve. You want to have what you want to have. And you don't want to use people to do it, but you will. Part of what makes this so tricky for us in all of these conversations is that these idols or these trophies in our lives that trip us up, they aren't usually bad things. In fact, most of the time, they're good things, which is really confusing. But here's the deal. Good things become bad things when they pull us away from the best thing. That idea is at the heart of this whole conversation. See, there's nothing wrong with power. Power isn't the problem. We're reminded that every time the electricity goes out, right? Power, when it's channeled and used correctly, when it's pursued and leveraged in a healthy way, it's a really good thing. God created you to be powerful. You were made in his image, the God, all powerful. You were created with the capacity to affect reality, to influence the world physically and emotionally and spiritually. God gave all of that to you. He created all of that inside of you. But when sin and brokenness separated us from God, we didn't lose our power. We just lost the relationship that gives us the context for understanding what it's for and how to use it. And honestly, you don't have to believe any of this stuff or be a follower of Jesus for at least part of this to be ringing true for you. Even without the scriptures, we just sort of intuitively know, because this truth, this idea that I'm talking about today, it's been shared in all kinds of other myths and cliches and fables and parables. It's the skeleton of 1,000 great stories. The difference is, when you open the scriptures, the difference is the person of Jesus, that there's just something unique and beautiful, something altogether different about him, especially when it comes to power. So there's this absolutely stunning moment in John chapter 13. Jesus is having what will end up being one of his last meals with his disciples before he's arrested and crucified. This is what it says in John 13, verse 2. It says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he's sitting down at the table with his friends. He's sitting down. None of them know it, but Jesus knows that Judas is already making plans to betray him. He's sitting down to have a meal with Judas. Man, that would be hard. And as he's sitting there, Jesus is at this point, fully recognizes, fully realizes that God has put all the power in him, that God has put all the power under his feet, that everything, there's nothing that he cannot do, there's nothing that he cannot have, there's nothing that he cannot achieve. So Jesus understands that everything is under his power. Can you imagine? I mean, think about that for a moment. What would you do if you were in that setting? I know what I'd do. The first thing I do, if I realized sitting at this moment with these people and that guy's about to betray me and I realize I have all the power, I'm going to have a little come to Jesus meeting with Judas. And what does Jesus do? Verse 4 says, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. I've read this story and these verses more times than I can count, 1,000 times, I mean, just in my lifetime. I've never gotten over the hard right turn that this story takes. To me, verse 4 is a total non sequitur. It does not logically flow from what was said in verse 3. It doesn't make sense coming out of verse 3. Have you ever been around somebody who does that non sequitur thing where they say one thing and then the end of the sentence is a completely different thought? Man, I'm loving the cooler weather, and I've always said that cats are better than dogs. You're just what? Right? Something happened in their brain that connected those thoughts. It just didn't make it out of their mouth. So you're just I don't know what you're talking about. Now, if you've ever read this story before and you've read verse 3, if you were coming at this with brand new eyes and you read this story, you read verse 3, this would not be at all what you'd expect to happen next. That in the moment that Jesus knows that all the power has been given to him, that he's come from God and he's going back to God, he gets up, he straps on a towel, and he starts washing their feet? What? So culturally, foot washing was a pretty ordinary part of their life for them at that point in time. But here's the thing, you kind of need to know how people looked at feet then compared to how people look at feet now. And it's exactly the same. Feet are gross, especially sweaty sandal feet. Those of you that wear Crocs. Which was why for them it was the job of the lowest type of servants to wash people's feet. It certainly wasn't something that a rabbi would do, let alone a savior would ever do, but it's exactly what Jesus does. And here's the thing. Jesus did not lay aside his power so that he could love and serve people. It was the way he exercised his power was to get up and love and serve them. And this is kind of the key to this whole conversation today. The exercise of power was always intended to fuel the expression of love for other people. See, the real measure of our power, it isn't how big we make ourselves. It isn't how great we become. It isn't what we accomplish or build. Because if that was the case, Solomon would have stood at the end of his life and said, I did it, you guys. Do what I did. But he didn't. The real measure of our power, it's the way that we serve and we demonstrate love for other people. There's a moment in Matthew 20 when all of Jesus' disciples are kind of secretly fighting for and jockeying for power and position. And they're wanting to, who's going to be closer to him and who's going to get who's going to get to sit in the best chair and have the best places. And Jesus calls them all together and he's like, look, guys, I get it. I know how the world works. I know what power looks like out there, but that's not who we're going to be. That's not what we're going to be about. We're going to handle power differently. See, Jesus repeatedly invites us to stop clinging to that which we can't keep anyway. The more you hold on to it, the less you have and the emptier your life becomes. But the more that you give it away, the deeper and richer your life will be, overflowing with power and purpose. See, Jesus didn't come to invite us to a way to believe. When we talk about it that way in church, we do his life and his message and his mission a disservice. We demean it. It wasn't just a way to believe. He invites us into a way to live. And honestly, when we get this right, when we lay down this trophy, when we tear down that idol of power in our hearts, there's so much freedom and peace that comes rushing in. I mean, think about your life for a moment. Think about the trophies that you're chasing. Think about the people and the things that you're holding on so tightly to. Think about your relationship with power. What is it that you believe about it? What is it that you do with the power that you have in your life? Every single Sunday this month, one of the practical things that we're going to do to overcome our tendency to kind of chase these trophies is to actually fill our minds with God's truth. And so we're going to have a verse every single week that we're memorizing together. See, because we can actually learn how to embrace the kind of power that Jesus calls us to. And this is what he actually says to his disciples in Matthew 20 when they were fighting about power. This is what he says. He says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And if we're honest, we're just like, yeah, that sounds great. It's kind of a Yoda thing to do, say Jesus, but I'd rather not be a servant. And Jesus would go, it's your life. You can be big. You can have all the power. You can become greater than anybody in your generation and your family and all the accomplishments. And you will get to the end. And you will stand with Solomon and say, it was all meaningless. See, the surprising reality is that when we actually leverage our power for other people instead of ourselves, that it's in that moment that we begin to discover the purpose for our lives that we so desperately long for. And that's true whether you have been a follower of Jesus your whole life, and that's true whether you're just not even sure that any of this is real. That Jesus is inviting you into a way of living, into a relationship with him, where you lay down all the meaningless trophies and you begin to leverage your life for something bigger, deeper, more profound. Let's pray together. God, what a just deep and challenging conversation for us to step into. Lord, when we examine really the deep desires of our heart, when we're willing to sit with ourselves and reflect on our motivations and be honest about our true desires, what we're really chasing after. God, so often we don't even go to those places because we're just so busy in the scramble, so busy in the hunt for the next thing. Sometimes, God, it gets really uncomfortable because we sort of pull back the curtain and we see the darkness of our own souls. Most of the time we can cover it over and we know how to behave socially acceptably and how to treat people. But God, if we're honest, we all have a shadow side. We all have a darkness that we're just doing our best to manage. Oftentimes, our very deepest passions of our life are coming from places that we don't always know how to handle. In this conversation this month, God, we just want to be honest with you and with ourselves, and open ourselves up before you. And we know you already know. You can see inside of us. You know us better than we know ourselves. I'm so grateful that you didn't come, that you're not calling us to a life of weakness, but you're calling us to a life where our power is leveraged for the good, for the benefit, for the freedom and opportunity, for the blessing of people around us. Jesus, as we look at your life, when you knew that you had all the power in the world, and you got up and you leveraged that power to serve and love the people around you. That is the life that you invite us into. And if we're being honest, there's a consideration that we do. There's some math that we run on that, on whether or not that's really what we want. The beautiful thing is, whenever we make a trade with you, we're always the ones that come out on top. That if we will step into that life and begin to live like you lived, begin to trust you and follow you into the unknown, that our life becomes so much bigger, so much deeper, so much fuller, that we actually become alive. Lord, I pray first of all, for those of us who have been Christians and believers and followers of Jesus for a while, God, that we would honestly examine our hearts. It's easy for us to think that because we believe in Jesus, that there isn't anything else that we're looking to in our life to get what we should only and we can only get from you. But the reality is, we have those things all over our lives, just like everybody else. So, Lord, I pray, God, that you would just speak truth and whisper into our souls. God, that you would open our eyes, that we'd be honest. Lord, I pray for those that are really watching from afar. They're at a distance. They're asking questions. They're exploring. They're wondering if there's something to this Jesus stuff. I pray that you would meet them exactly where they're at. God, that they would be overwhelmed with your love. That this morning they would know that when you got up from the table, that it's their feet that you came to wash, that you came to love them, to clean up their heart and their life, to bring life and freedom and grace and truth to their soul. Lord, in this moment, God, they reach out to you by faith and embrace what you've done for them. that their soul comes alive. For all of us, God, this week, may we take the power that we've been given, power to shape and influence the world around us, power to make a difference in the physical world, the emotional relationships, spiritually, that we would leverage all that we are, that it would fuel the expression of love for the world around us. Thank you for today. In your name we pray. Amen.
Church,
Amen.
I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that He's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the third way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because the Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the fourth way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that He can bless and anoint your finances, and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you, and thank you for watching our online service today.